The sonarman pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. The pinging return was faint, but it was there. The U-boat was below them, moving slowly, perhaps trying to slip away beneath the thermal layer, where sound waves bent and detection became difficult. The destroyer escort had been hunting this submarine for 6 hours. Depth charges had been dropped. Contact had been lost and regained. The U-boat captain was skilled. He knew how to use water conditions to hide. He knew when to go deep and when to change course. The destroyer escort was burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. The convoy it was supposed to be protecting had moved on, leaving the escort alone with the submarine in open ocean. If contact was lost again, the U-boat would escape. The sonar man listened to the return pattern. The submarine was turning. He could hear the Doppler shift as the target's bearing changed. The captain asked for a recommendation. Standard doctrine said to pursue, to stay above the target and drop charges when position was optimal. But the sonarman had been tracking this particular U-boat's behavior for hours. He had noticed a pattern. Every time the destroyer closed, the U-boat turned away. Every time the destroyer slowed, the U-boat adjusted course as if monitoring the surface vessel's movements. The sonar man made a suggestion that contradicted training. He recommended that the destroyer turn away from the submarine and reduce speed, making it appear they were breaking off the attack. The captain stared at him. The executive officer said it was insane. If they turned away, the U-boat would escape. But the sonarman explained his reasoning. The U-boat commander thought he was being hunted. If the destroyer appeared to give up, the submarine might surface or move to periscope depth to verify the threat was gone. At that depth, it would be vulnerable. To understand how this gamble resulted in one of the most unusual kills of the Atlantic campaign, we must go back. By the spring of 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The introduction of escort carriers, improved radar, and enhanced sonar had broken the U-boat offensive that had nearly severed the supply lines between America and Britain. German submarines still operated, but their effectiveness had declined sharply. Where once they hunted in coordinated wolf packs, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced, they now operated individually, under constant threat from air and surface patrols. The survival rate for U-boat crews had dropped to levels that made each patrol a likely death sentence. Yet the submarines continued to sail, partly because orders demanded it, partly because the strategic situation left Germany few alternatives. If the Atlantic supply route remained open, the Allied buildup in Britain would continue. The invasion of France, clearly being prepared, would succeed. Germany's only hope was to disrupt logistics enough to delay or complicate Allied plans. This required submarines at sea, hunting, even as the odds turned against them. The U-boats that survived into 1944 were generally commanded by experienced captains who had learned through necessity how to evade increasingly sophisticated Allied countermeasures. They understood Allied tactics. They knew how destroyers hunted. They exploited every advantage the ocean provided. The destroyer escort that would engage in this unusual confrontation was the USS Buckley, a small warship designed specifically for convoy protection. Destroyer escorts were not fleet destroyers. They were slower, less heavily armed, and built to a budget that prioritized numbers over capability. The United States needed hundreds of escort vessels to protect the merchant convoys that sustained the war effort. Fleet destroyers were too expensive and too valuable to dedicate entirely to escort duty. Destroyer escorts filled the gap. They carried enough armament to threaten submarines and enough speed to keep pace with convoys. They were uncomfortable, cramped, and prone to violent motion in rough seas. Crews lived in conditions that would have been unacceptable on larger ships. But the vessels were effective. They carried sonar for detection, depth charges for attack, and guns for surface action. A well-handled destroyer escort could kill a submarine if it achieved contact and maintained it long enough to prosecute an attack. The challenge was maintaining contact. Submarines could dive deep, hide in thermal layers, turn unpredictably, and employ decoys. A competent U-boat commander could evade a single escort for hours, exhausting its fuel and depth charges until it had to withdraw. The sonarman who would conceive the unconventional tactic was Petty Officer First Class Robert Mathis, and he had been operating sonar equipment since joining the Buckley's crew at its commissioning 9 months earlier. Matthysse had grown up in coastal North Carolina, where he had worked on fishing boats before the war. He understood the ocean not as an abstract space, but as an environment with moods and conditions. Water temperature affected fish behavior. Currents influenced where schools gathered. Weather changed everything. When he trained on sonar equipment, he approached it with the same practical mindset. Sonar was a tool for finding things underwater. Understanding what the equipment could and could not do was essential. Sonar worked by sending sound pulses through the water and listening for echoes. When a pulse struck something solid, it reflected back. The time delay between transmission and return indicated distance. The strength of the return indicated size and material. A submarine returned a strong, sharp echo. A school of fish returned a diffuse, scattered echo. Rock formations returned echoes that did not move between pings. The equipment was straightforward in principle, but complex in practice. Water conditions affected sound propagation. Temperature layers bent sound waves, creating shadow zones where submarines could hide. Biological activity created background noise that masked contacts. The ocean was not silent. It churned with sounds from waves, marine life, and distant ships. A sonar operator had to filter all of this, distinguishing meaningful returns from noise. Mathis was good at this. He had developed an ear for the equipment. Where other operators struggled to interpret ambiguous returns, Mathis could often identify what he was hearing. He recognized the characteristic echo of a submarine's hull, distinct from the softer return of a whale, or the irregular scatter from a school of fish. He could hear when a contact was moving toward or away by the slight change in pitch caused by Doppler effect. He understood how water layers affected detection and learned to adjust search patterns accordingly. His competence was recognized. The Buckley's captain, Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel, relied on Mathis more than most captains relied on their sonar operators. Abel understood his own limitations. He had trained in surface warfare, but had limited experience with anti-submarine operations before taking command of the Buckley. He depended on his crew's technical expertise. When Mathis reported a contact, Abel trusted the assessment. When Mathis suggested a course adjustment to improve detection conditions, Abel usually complied. This trust was mutual. Mathis respected that Abel listened to his crew and made decisions based on their input rather than rigid adherence to doctrine. On May 6, 1944, the Buckley was escorting a small convoy crossing the Atlantic from New York to Britain. The convoy consisted of 12 merchant ships carrying war materiel. The crossing was considered relatively safe. The main U-boat threat had been pushed away from the primary convoy routes. Most sinkings now occurred either close to the European coast or in areas where air cover was limited. The convoy route had been chosen to maximize air coverage from land-based patrol aircraft. But air coverage was never complete. Gaps existed, particularly at night and in poor weather. The convoy entered one such gap on the morning of May 6th. Cloud cover was heavy. Visibility was poor. The escorting destroyer and 2 corvettes maintained positions around the merchant ships, but detection conditions were difficult. At 0800 hours, Mathis detected a contact on sonar. The range was approximately 3,000 yards, bearing 270 degrees. The contact was moving slowly, crossing ahead of the convoy. Mathis reported it to the bridge. Abel ordered course change to investigate. The Buckley broke from the convoy and accelerated toward the contact. Mathis tracked it continuously. The return was consistent with a submarine. As the range closed, the contact turned away and began to dive. This was classic submarine behavior when detected. Go deep, go quiet, evade. Abel ordered attack speed. The Buckley closed to drop depth charges, but the U-boat was maneuvering. By the time the destroyer escort reached the drop point, the submarine had moved. The charges detonated, massive explosions that sent columns of water into the air, but there was no evidence of damage. Mathis regained contact. The submarine was now deeper, moving at a different heading. The hunt continued. Over the next 6 hours, the pattern repeated. The Buckley closed. The U-boat evaded. Depth charges were dropped. Contact was lost and regained. The submarine commander was skilled. He changed depth frequently, exploited thermal layers, and turned unpredictably. He was not trying to attack. He was trying to escape. But he was also not succeeding. Matthysse kept finding him. Each time contact was lost, Matthysse adjusted his search and picked up the echo again. The U-boat could not break away cleanly. But neither could the Buckley achieve a killing position. The submarine stayed just ahead, just deep enough, just maneuverable enough to avoid destruction. Fuel became a concern. The Buckley had been at attack speed for hours. The fuel consumption rate was high. Abel calculated that if the hunt continued at this pace, they would have to break off within 2 hours to retain enough fuel to rejoin the convoy. The U-boat commander might know this. He might be deliberately dragging out the engagement, waiting for the escort to exhaust itself. Depth charges were also running low. The Buckley had dropped 18 charges. 24 remained. Doctrine called for patterns of 5 or more charges per attack to ensure adequate coverage. At that rate, the ship could conduct perhaps 4 more attacks before running out. If those attacks did not kill or severely damage the submarine, the Buckley would have to withdraw, regardless of fuel status. At 1400 hours, Mathis regained contact after another loss. The submarine was approximately 2,000 yards ahead, moving southeast at slow speed. Mathis listened carefully to the return pattern. He tracked the bearing change over several pings. The submarine was turning again, shifting course to the east. Mathis had been listening to this submarine for 6 hours. He had heard it turn dozens of times. He had noticed something. Every time the Buckley closed, aggressively, the U-boat turned sharply and dove. Every time the Buckley reduced speed or altered course, the U-boat adjusted more cautiously, as if assessing the threat. The submarine commander was reacting to the destroyer escort's behavior. He was not just evading blindly. He was thinking, predicting, adapting. Mathis realized that the U-boat commander believed he was winning. The destroyer had not landed a killing blow despite hours of effort. The U-boat had evaded every attack. From the submarine's perspective, the surface threat was persistent, but not immediately dangerous. If the destroyer gave up, the U-boat could surface or come shallow to ventilate the boat and recharge batteries. Submarines could not remain submerged indefinitely. They needed to surface or reach periscope depth periodically. The longer a submarine stayed deep, the more the air quality degraded and the more the batteries drained. After 6 hours submerged and maneuvering, the U-boat would need to come shallow soon. Mathis made his suggestion to Abel. Turn away from the submarine. Reduce speed. Make it appear the Buckley was breaking off the attack. If the U-boat commander believed the threat was gone, he might surface or come shallow. At that point, the Buckley could turn back and catch the submarine in a vulnerable position. Abel considered the idea. The executive officer objected immediately. Turning away meant losing contact. If the U-boat did not surface and instead continued its evasion, the Buckley would have wasted time and distance. Reacquiring contact would be difficult. The submarine could move in any direction while the destroyer escort was turned away. The risk was substantial, but Abel saw the logic in Mathis's reasoning. The standard approach was not working. The U-boat was evading successfully. Continuing the same tactic would exhaust the Buckley's resources without result. Trying something unexpected might create an opening. Abel asked Matthysse how confident he was in his assessment. Matthysse said he believed the U-boat commander was tracking the destroyer's movements and making decisions based on perceived threat. If the threat appeared to diminish, the submarine's behavior would change. Abel made the decision. He ordered the Buckley to turn away from the contact and reduce speed to 1/3. The destroyer escort came about, turning to the northwest, away from the submarine's last known position. Speed dropped. The sound of the ship's screws diminished. To anyone listening from below, it would sound like the escort was leaving the area. Matthysse kept his sonar active, but reduced ping rate. Frequent pinging would indicate continued active search. Reducing the rate made it seem like the destroyer was conducting routine sweeps rather than focused hunting. The bridge crew was tense. Minutes passed. Abel asked for updates. Mathis reported that the contact had faded, but that was expected given the range and the Buckley's course change. The submarine was no longer in optimal detection range. If it remained at depth and continued southeast, it would escape. If it came shallow, Mathis would detect it. 10 minutes after the turn, Mathis reported a new contact. The submarine had changed depth. It was rising. The bearing was consistent with its previous position. It had not moved laterally. It was coming up. Abel ordered course reversal immediately. The Buckley turned hard, coming back around toward the submarine. Speed increased to flank. The destroyer escort surged forward. The U-boat was still rising. Mathis tracked it. The submarine was now at periscope depth. It had not surfaced fully, but was shallow enough that its position was exposed. Abel ordered gun crews to ready. If the submarine surfaced, they would engage with deck guns. If it dove again, they would drop charges. The range closed rapidly. The Buckley was now moving at maximum speed toward a target that was nearly stationary. The U-boat commander must have realized his error. The submarine began to dive again, crash diving to escape. But it was too late. The Buckley was already on top of the position. Abel ordered a full pattern drop. 8 depth charges rolled off the stern and were launched from side projectors. The charges were set for shallow detonation, optimized for a target at the depth the submarine had just been. The charges sank and detonated in sequence. The ocean erupted. Columns of water rose and fell. The Buckley shook from the concussions. Mathis listened. The submarine echo had changed. It was no longer a clean return. The echo was breaking up, distorted. He reported possible damage. Abel ordered the Buckley to circle and prepare another attack. But before they could reposition, the ocean surface began to churn. Debris appeared. Oil spread across the water in a growing slick. Wood fragments, pieces of equipment, and other material floated up. The submarine had been hit hard. Then something unexpected happened. The submarine surfaced, not voluntarily. It breached the surface bow first, propelled by internal explosions or flooding that forced it up. The conning tower broke through, followed by the forward hull. The submarine was severely damaged. Hatches opened, and crew began emerging. Some jumped into the water. Others climbed onto the deck. The Buckley's crew saw German sailors abandoning their vessel. Abel ordered ceasefire. The submarine was finished. There was no need to kill men in the water. But the U-boat was still dangerous. A damaged submarine could still fire torpedoes if its tubes were loaded and operational. Abel kept the Buckley at a cautious distance, circling. The German crew continued to abandon ship. More men appeared, perhaps 30 or 40 in total. They wore life jackets and clustered in the water near the sinking hull. Then the submarine began to settle. Water poured through the open hatches. The bow dipped. The stern rose. Within 3 minutes, the U-boat slid beneath the surface and disappeared. The men in the water were left behind. Abel ordered rescue operations. The Buckley approached slowly, crew members lining the rails with lines and life rings. The German sailors were pulled aboard. They were exhausted, cold, and in shock. Some were injured from the depth charge explosions or from the scramble to abandon ship. The Buckley's medical personnel treated them. The rescued men were taken below and confined. 43 German sailors were recovered. The U-boat's commander was among them. He was brought to Abel. Through an interpreter, the two officers spoke briefly. The German captain asked how the destroyer escort had known he was surfacing. Abel did not provide details, but said that the Buckley had anticipated his actions. The German captain said nothing more. The U-boat was identified as U-66, a Type 9 submarine that had been operating in the Atlantic for over 2 years. It had sunk multiple merchant ships earlier in the war. Its captain, Korvettenkapitän Gerhard Seehausen, was an experienced officer with several patrols behind him. He had survived when many of his peers had not. His tactics had been sound. He had evaded the Buckley for 6 hours, using every technique available to him. But he had made an assumption that proved fatal. He had assumed that when the destroyer escort turned away, it was abandoning the hunt. That assumption was reasonable, based on standard Allied tactics. Escorts did not usually persist for hours against a single submarine. They had convoys to protect and could not afford to expend all their resources on one target. Seehausen had believed the threat was diminishing, and that he could safely rise to periscope depth to assess the situation and ventilate the boat. The decision was tactically sound under normal circumstances, but the circumstances were not normal. Mathis had predicted the decision, and Abel had acted on that prediction. The result was that the submarine had surfaced directly into an attack it could not evade. The engagement was unusual enough that it attracted attention when the Buckley returned to port. Abel's report described the tactics used and credited Mathis with the idea that made the kill possible. Naval analysts reviewed the engagement. The tactic of feigning withdrawal to lure a submarine into exposing itself was not entirely new, but it was rarely employed, and almost never successfully. Most commanders did not trust that a submarine would fall for the deception. Most were unwilling to risk losing contact by turning away. The risk was considered too high relative to the uncertain benefit. But Mathis had not suggested the tactic as a general approach. He had suggested it based on specific observations of this specific submarine's behavior. He had tracked the U-boat for hours and noticed patterns in how it reacted. The tactic was tailored to the situation. That specificity was important. It meant the success could not be easily replicated without similar conditions and observations. Naval doctrine was not revised to include feigned withdrawal as a standard tactic, but the engagement was documented as a case study in adaptive thinking. Commanders were reminded that doctrine provided guidance, not absolute rules. Situations arose where unconventional approaches were justified if they were based on sound reasoning and specific intelligence. Mathis was commended and recommended for promotion. He was also interviewed extensively by anti-submarine warfare specialists who wanted to understand his thought process. Matthysse explained that he had been listening to the U-boat for so long that he had started to anticipate its behavior. He compared it to tracking fish. If you watched where fish went when boats approached, you could predict where they would go next. The submarine was similar. It reacted to threats in patterns. Once he recognized the pattern, he could predict the reaction. The specialist asked if this skill could be taught. Mathis said he did not know. He had learned it through experience and by paying attention. Perhaps others could learn the same way. Perhaps not. The interview reports noted that Mathisse's background in fishing might have contributed to his ability to think in terms of behavioral patterns rather than purely mechanical detection. This was speculative, but it suggested that diverse backgrounds among sonar operators might be valuable. The Navy began recruiting more personnel with maritime experience, not just technical training. The German survivors, including Seehausen, were transported to prisoner of war camps in the United States. They were interrogated about their submarine's capabilities, operations, and tactics. Seehausen was cooperative, but provided only information that was already known, or that he believed would not compromise ongoing operations. He was asked about the final moments of the engagement. He confirmed that he had believed the destroyer escort was withdrawing. He had risen to periscope depth to confirm this and to prepare to surface for battery recharging. He had not anticipated that the destroyer would return so quickly, or that it had been deliberately creating the appearance of withdrawal. When asked if he would have done anything differently, he said he would not have risen to periscope depth so soon. He would have waited longer to ensure the threat was truly gone. But waiting longer would have meant remaining submerged in deteriorating conditions. The air was foul. The batteries were nearly depleted. The crew was exhausted. He had needed to make a decision, and he had made it based on the information available. That the information was incomplete was unfortunate, but not something he could have known. This response was candid and revealed the pressures U-boat commanders faced. Decisions had to be made with imperfect information under time constraints. Sometimes those decisions were correct. Sometimes they were not. The loss of U-66 contributed to the broader attrition of the U-boat fleet. By mid-1944, German submarine losses exceeded replacements. Training programs could not produce new crews fast enough. Shipyards could not build submarines fast enough. The strategic situation was irreversible. Each U-boat lost weakened Germany's ability to threaten Allied shipping. The Atlantic supply route remained open. The build-up for the invasion of France continued uninterrupted. On June 6th, 1 month after the destruction of U-66, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The invasion succeeded in part because the logistical preparations had not been disrupted. Those preparations depended on merchant convoys crossing the Atlantic safely. Those convoys were protected by escorts like the Buckley. The connection between a single anti-submarine engagement in May and the success of the invasion in June was indirect but real. Wars are won by accumulation. Each small success contributes to larger outcomes. Mathis remained with the Buckley for the remainder of the war. The ship continued escort duties, crossing the Atlantic multiple times. Additional submarine contacts occurred, but none resulted in engagements as prolonged or as unusual as the U-66 encounter. Mathis continued operating sonar, training new crew members, and refining his techniques. He was promoted to Chief Petty Officer in August 1944. After the war ended, he was discharged and returned to North Carolina. He went back to fishing, working on commercial boats. The transition was easier than for many veterans. He returned to work he knew, and to a community that welcomed him back. He married in 1947 and raised 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he said he had operated sonar on a destroyer escort. He did not describe the U-66 engagement unless pressed. Even then, he minimized his role. He had suggested a tactic. The captain had made the decision. The crew had executed it. Everyone had contributed. In the 1960s, a naval historian researching anti-submarine warfare contacted Mathis while compiling a detailed study of destroyer escort operations. Mathis agreed to an interview and provided his recollections of the engagement. He described the hours of tracking, the frustration of repeated evasions, and the moment he realized the U-boat commander was reacting predictably. He explained his reasoning for suggesting the feigned withdrawal. The historian asked if Mathis had been certain the tactic would work. Mathis said no. He had been confident it might work, but not certain. There was always risk. The U-boat could have behaved differently, but the standard approach was failing, and trying something else seemed worth the risk. The historian's study was published in 1968 and included a detailed chapter on the U-66 engagement. The book was read primarily by military professionals and historians, but it brought some attention to Mathis. He received letters from former Navy personnel who had served in anti-submarine roles. Some shared their own experiences. Others simply thanked him for his service. Mathis answered the letters politely, but did not seek further attention. The U-66 wreck was located in the 1990s by a deep-sea survey team. It rests at a depth of approximately 4,000 feet, broken into sections. The damage from the depth charges is visible. The pressure hull was ruptured in multiple places. The wreck is considered a war grave and is protected under international maritime law. No salvage has been attempted. The site was documented photographically, and the images were archived. Families of the men who died aboard U-66 were notified of the wreck's location. Some expressed interest in visiting the site, though the depth makes that impractical for most people. The wreck remains undisturbed, a memorial to the 43 men who did not survive. The broader lessons from the engagement extended beyond tactics. The encounter demonstrated the value of situational awareness and adaptive thinking. Mathis had not followed a script. He had observed, analyzed, and proposed an action based on his analysis. Abel had trusted his judgment and acted on it. The success depended on both men. A sonar operator without a captain willing to take his suggestion seriously would have accomplished nothing. A captain without a skilled sonar operator would not have had the option. The relationship between technical specialists and commanders is central to effective military operations. Technical specialists understand systems and conditions that commanders may not. Commanders have authority and responsibility that specialists do not. When the relationship functions well, decisions are informed by the best available information and expertise. When it does not, opportunities are missed and errors accumulate. The Buckley's success reflected a functional relationship. This was not universal in the Navy. Some captains did not trust their enlisted crew's judgment. Some specialists were reluctant to speak up, even when they had valuable insights. The culture varied by ship and by personalities involved. Efforts to improve technical training and to emphasize the importance of communication between officers and crew were ongoing throughout the war and continued afterward. The anti-submarine war in the Atlantic is often presented as a technological contest. Better radar, better sonar, better weapons, better tactics. All of these mattered, but the human element remained central. Equipment provided capabilities, but people decided how to use those capabilities. The Buckley had the same sonar as hundreds of other destroyer escorts. Mathis used it more effectively because he understood not just the equipment, but the context in which it operated. He thought about what the submarine was doing and why. He built a mental model of the enemy commander's decision-making. He used that model to predict behavior. This was not something that could be reduced to a checklist or a set of procedures. It required judgment, intuition informed by experience, and willingness to take risks. These qualities could be encouraged, but not mandated. The Navy recognized this and tried to create conditions where such qualities could flourish. Better training helped. Better equipment helped. But ultimately, success depended on individuals like Mathis, who brought something extra to their roles. The tactic of feigned withdrawal appeared in subsequent anti-submarine engagements, though rarely. A few commanders tried it with mixed results. Some successfully lured submarines into vulnerable positions. Others lost contact and never regained it. The tactic was situational. It worked when the submarine commander was predictable and when conditions allowed the surface vessel to regain contact quickly. When those conditions did not exist, the tactic was simply a way to lose a contact. Post-war analysis concluded that the tactic should be considered an option, but not a standard procedure. Commanders were advised to use it only when they had strong reason to believe the submarine was reacting predictably and when other approaches had failed. This guidance aligned with how Matthysse and Abel had used it. They had not employed the tactic blindly. They had used it in response to specific circumstances. Mathis lived until 1996. He was 74. He had continued fishing until his health declined in the early 1990s. His children took over the family business. He spent his final years in a small house near the coast, where he could still see the ocean. He watched boats come and go, a rhythm that had defined most of his life. He died of heart failure in his sleep. His obituary mentioned his naval service and noted that he had been part of a notable engagement, but provided few details. His family held a small funeral. Former crew members from the Buckley attended. They shared stories and remembered the ship and the men they had served with. Matthysse's son donated some of his father's papers to a naval museum, including notes Mathis had kept during the war. The notes were not extensive. They included technical observations about sonar performance, sketches of contact patterns, and brief descriptions of engagements. They provided insight into how Mathis thought about his work. The museum archived them alongside other materials from destroyer escort operations. The destroyer escort USS Buckley survived the war. It continued service through 1946, then was placed in reserve. It was reactivated during the Korean War and served in training roles. It was finally decommissioned in 1968 and sold for scrap. Parts of the ship were preserved, including a plaque commemorating the U-66 engagement. The plaque is now displayed at a naval museum. Abel, the Buckley's captain, continued in the Navy after the war. He commanded other ships and eventually retired as a captain in 1962. He remained in contact with several crew members, including Matthysse. They exchanged letters occasionally, usually around anniversaries of the ship's commissioning or significant engagements. Abel consistently credited Mathis with the idea that made the U-66 kill possible. In interviews and written accounts, he emphasized that the success was a team effort, but that Mathis's insight had been the critical factor. The engagement remains a case study in naval education. It appears in anti-submarine warfare courses, not as an example of standard tactics, but as an example of how thinking beyond standard tactics can succeed. Students analyze the engagement, discussing what made Mathis's suggestion reasonable and what risks it entailed. They consider how commanders should balance doctrine with adaptive approaches. They examine the relationship between technical specialists and command authority. The case study serves its purpose. It prompts students to think critically about decision-making under uncertainty. It reinforces that success in combat often requires more than following procedures. It requires judgment, courage to act on imperfect information, and willingness to trust the expertise of others. These lessons extend beyond anti-submarine warfare. They apply to any situation where decisions must be made under pressure with incomplete information. The story of the engagement is not widely known outside military and naval history circles. It did not involve famous ships or famous commanders. It was one action among thousands in a war that lasted years and involved millions of people. But for the men aboard the Buckley and the men aboard U-66, it was the defining moment of their war. For the Allied sailors, it was a successful hunt, a demonstration that skill and unconventional thinking could overcome a determined adversary. For the German sailors, it was the end of their war, the moment when their luck ran out and their submarine was destroyed. 43 men were pulled from the water. 21 men went down with the boat. Those numbers are recorded in casualty lists and operational reports. Behind each number was a person with a life that preceded the war, and, for the survivors, a life that continued after. Seehausen, the U-66's commander, spent the remainder of the war in captivity. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He returned to find his country devastated, divided, and occupied. He worked in various civilian roles, never returning to military service. He wrote a memoir in the 1950s that included an account of his final patrol. He described the engagement with the Buckley honestly, acknowledging the tactical error that led to his capture. He expressed respect for the escort crew's skill. He did not express bitterness. War had ended. He had survived when many had not. That was enough.